Thank you for being here in this session around Gherkin, some of the common anti-patterns that George and I have observed over the years. And I'm sure you'll recognize them if your teams are using BDD and Gherkin or Cucumber, some of these practices. So very excited to be here, and let's just get started here. So George and I have been partnering on all things agile for a long time, as Bob said, early 2000s. So super excited to be here. All right. The conversation today is around Gherkin and its anti-patterns. But before we talk about Gherkin, I think it's important for all of us to sort of provide the context. And to that end, I want to just spend a few minutes to talk about the context. And the context would be behavior-driven development, a practice, one of the test-driven practices. I'm going to talk about Gherkin writing and such, and the anti-patterns within that context. So clearly, most of you here know what BDD is and what problems they're trying to solve. So just to bring this all together, so here's a little snippet from Dan North, the creator of behavior-driven development. It's just a snippet from one of his books, or the saying, BDD is about collaboration and conversation to discover the essential requirements, using examples, as Camille said, expressed in a common language to build software that matters, building the right thing. So as you look at this, at least to me, the key things that come to mind when I look at this sentence and description of BDD is it begins with a conversation, and there's collaboration among some key players who are building the software. It's about requirements elicitation. It's about using rules and examples. It's about using some sort of a common notation that we can all understand, and to create that shared understanding across the various roles. So this is the purpose for BDD, and BDD provides the structures and the techniques in order to make all of these things happen. And the problems in my mind, at least in terms of the key things, problems it's trying to solve is this, right? What Shivan mentioned, bridging the communication gap among the different roles, specifically ensuring that IT and business are aligned in terms of what we're building, and creating that shared understanding across the various roles, and feedback and quality. Feedback through test automation, if you're going to use these Gherkin scenarios as executable specifications and automate them using tools such as Cucumber, SpecFlow, what have you, you have that fast feedback cycle on the health of your system. And quality also in terms of, are we really building the right thing, right? So, so now that we have this understanding of what BDD is and what fundamental problems it's trying to solve, let's take a look a little bit at the process. The BDD process, I'm going to just list the 4 distinct steps, right? It begins with a conversation. This is the illustration of the discovery phase, if you will, of the cyclical process, where the multiple perspectives, usually I think Bob, who's here, has been part of that initial journey where they coined the term the 3 amigos way back when. So it's a popular term in the industry these days. You want at least 3 perspectives: business, testing, development, could be UX, other perspectives. But anyway, these folks, multiple perspectives coming together to understand what is it that we are trying to build, what are these features, stories, and trying to understand through these rules and examples, also called acceptance criteria. So the tools at this stage during the discovery are not Cucumber, Gherkin, nothing. It's whiteboard, stickies, just conversations. Yes, there are techniques such as feature mapping, example mapping that help us provide structure to these conversations, but that's what happens during this discovery stage of the BDD 4-step process. Now that feeds into the formulation where the conversations that are being had among the 3+ amigos, they're distilled into something that can help drive the design and development, as well as some of the automated acceptance tests. That's the formulate stage, where typically it's the BAs, testers, again, could be the developer, taking the essence of those conversations, the acceptance criteria, and through concrete examples, creating these various scenarios that illustrate that capability of that feature or story or what have you, right? That's the formulation, capturing those conversations in a structured manner that's easily understood by all parties. Keep in mind, right? This is about BDD. Gherkin is all about communication and collaboration. Yes, there's an aspect of automation that we talk about, but that's a tertiary benefit, if you will. The primary goal is about that collaboration and conversation using these executable specifications. So anyway, so Gherkin has emerged as a popular format to formulate these acceptance criteria and these examples, and that can help drive the design and development, and also the automated acceptance test if you so choose, using Cucumber, SpecFlow, and tools such as that. These tools understand the Gherkin syntax. So in this conversation, we're really not going to focus on the automation piece at all, but rather on the right way to craft those executable specifications, those Gherkin scenarios. Now, these automated tests, sorry, I clicked the wrong way. And these automated tests, of course, are there to help validate the correctness of the solution that's emerged and provide that constant feedback, and also inform, the next set of stories, features that you're building, and so forth, right? So what the BDD process is about, these various steps, and the single source of truth is really these executable specifications. And this is where the Gherkin piece comes into play. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is all too often in the industry, we talk about Gherkin, Cucumber, BDD, we just think about the automation piece and nothing else, right? We don't talk about the collaboration, we don't talk about that shared understanding, we don't talk about that bridge building between IT and business, right? So now, so coming back to what we are here to talk about, which is the formulation using that common language, this is where Gherkin comes in, right? So Gherkin, and as most of you seem to be already aware of, is just this business readable notation for expressing the behavior of the system, of your stories and your stories and features. Now, there are it's almost plain English, I'll say. And the reason I say it's almost plain English is because there's a structure and there are certain keywords that Gherkin specifies that we'll talk about in a second, and that play a part in terms of writing the right kind of Gherkin. So it is almost plain English, but everybody can clearly understand this in this simple example about ATM withdrawals. It's business readable, which is, again, part of the point of BDD and Gherkin is bridging the gap between business and IT. So we want to make sure that these scenarios or examples are articulated in such a manner that it's easily understood by technical and non-technical people. And what's nice is using Gherkin as your language for formulating your acceptance criteria and scenarios is that if you choose to go down the path of automation using for your acceptance test using Cucumber or some such tool that understands Gherkin, you absolutely can, right? So plain English, business readable, and executable, if you so desire, are aspects of what choosing the Gherkin syntax or tool provides for you, okay? Now, there are certain essentials that we need to understand before we get into the patterns and the anti-patterns and the fixes for them. And I'll only touch upon a few keywords to help us through the remainder of this presentation. And those would be the feature, scenario, and steps, so that we're all speaking the same language. So the Gherkin scenarios, typically are all housed within plain text files called feature files. And typically each feature file is annotated with that keyword feature, which describes the intent of that chunk of capability that your system is providing. And it starts with the feature keyword, some nice title about what the feature is. In this case, it's about ATM withdrawals. And everything between the feature and the keyword scenario is free text to help you sort of provide a description of what this feature is. And it also lets you house all related scenarios that illustrate that feature, okay? So that's one keyword. And then scenario is another keyword that you need to be familiar with, because scenario essentially illustrates a particular capability or aspect or example that feature provides that it's trying to sort of exemplify. That's a scenario. A scenario has a nice title, it's free form text, and the guidance is make sure that these titles are explaining the intent of what aspect of the feature you're trying to illustrate with this scenario. And a scenario typically has 3 distinct steps. Starts with the given, which is the precondition. It essentially sets that scenario or the test case into a certain context, right? So think of the given as the precondition for that scenario or the test case. Think of the when as the triggering action. So given that this system is in this state, when some action happens, so it's the triggering action, that's the when. And the then is the expected outcome as a result of that action, right? So scenario illustrates a particular aspect of the feature. The given, when, then steps are the precondition, the triggering action, and the expected outcome as a result of that action. And all of these are intended to express that particular scenario from a user's point of view and not the implementation detail. I'm not going to talk about go to this URL, click this button, blah, blah, blah. No, it is purely from the end user's perspective of the behavior of the system, right? And that's super important because I think, at least in our experience, as we show you some anti-patterns, too often these Gherkin scenarios tend to be too narrowly focused on a specific role, and they are not broad enough for easy consumption and understanding by all roles on your team. Okay, so, and there's additional keywords. I'm not going to get into that, but I think for now, understanding the feature scenario and scenario being made up of these steps, given, when, then, is sufficient for for our conversation. So, given that, I'm going to hand it off to George and say, it seems easy enough. Seems like this is the single source of truth that ties together the boundaries of these features and stories. It seems to help us with ease of understanding and seems to help with automation. So why doesn't everybody do this, right? What's so hard? So George, you want to just take it from here?
I will. Thank you, Raj. All right. Okay. So yeah, and thank you, Raj, so much for going into all of that. Provides a really great context and framework for how the rest of this conversation will go. Part of the beauty of Gherkin, as Raj was pointing out, is that it's supposed to be just plain English. It's supposed to provide a really good description of what a user needs to experience in the system. But part of the strength is in its flexibility, and that can often be a weakness as well. And certainly as you have many people on teams and maybe many teams working on these, it can be important to understand what some of the rules are for how to develop really good Gherkin scenarios, so that if you can avoid some of the anti-patterns that we're about to go into, you will have a test system that sends you as a team a strong signal when something breaks and will lead you to the right place to fix it. So before we get into the anti-patterns, let's go over some important rules that will help us understand why these anti-patterns are indeed anti-patterns, and then will help us kind of steer in the right direction toward overcoming them. So the first one, this golden rule, stipulates that we should write feature files so that everyone can intuitively understand them. This is, of course, incredibly important. If our Gherkin scenarios are written with a lot of technical detail, then we'll lose the essence of what is important about the behavior that we're trying to test for. The second one, the cardinal rule, and I guess it's a cardinal rule because really this is the most important one, is that one scenario should cover exactly one single independent behavior. This, as we will see as we go through the anti-patterns, becomes really paramount in being able to observe, good behaviors in Gherkin scenarios from bad ones, and will help us figure out the right way to do things. And then the final one really is to, not try to test all the things all at once. Focus on the most important things and avoid test duplication. Okay. So with that in mind, let's start looking at some of the Gherkin anti-patterns and offer some solutions. So here are, these aren't all of the Gherkin anti-patterns. These are ones that Raj and I have observed many, many times across multiple organizations. They seem to be there to bedevil, you know, everyone, everywhere. But if you can identify these, figure out and understand why they are bad, then really figuring out what to do about them will put you on the right path to Gherkin goodness or something like that. So the big ones are Scripty with implementation details, unclear test intent, lack of reusability, too long, and testing multiple scenarios at once, and then finally file organization. And just as a little aside, and if you weren't aware, Gherkin is a type of cucumber. And when we have a whole lot of cucumbers, I guess we have to figure out what we're going to do with them. And so maybe, you know, getting some sort of a facial and putting some cucumber slices over our eyes is maybe the best thing we can do to relax and figure out what to do next about them. All right. So the first Gherkin anti-pattern is Scripty with implementation details. Now, Raj mentioned just a little while ago that we should avoid being too technical in our Gherkin scenarios. And this particular scenario here is a good explanation. In this scenario, and as a little bit of background, I've been doing a little fix-it-up work around my house. So I've been going to a particular hardware store website to find some things, to do some things around the house. So that's really what inspired this particular anti-pattern. Nonetheless, let's try to figure out some of the things that are in here that are particularly technical and have implementation details. What we want to avoid is having a Gherkin scenario that tells us how something is going to be implemented. We really want it to illustrate what the expected behavior is. And we want it to be very clear and very concise. So we want to avoid anything like a hard-coded URL. Having URLs that are hard-coded, of course, any hard-coded URL is not great, but if we wanted to run this test against multiple test sites or maybe non-production sites, it doesn't help to have a hard-coded URL. We also want to avoid any unnecessary detail in the data setup. This one is kind of implying that there are some things that we're going to be inserting into the data setup. And if you look at the rest of the behavior that's being stipulated here, I don't really care about IDs, and I don't care whether the fixture, the appliance I'm looking for is heavy or not. So that's unnecessary. We also want to avoid things that mention particulars about a user interface, as an example. And this one would obviously imply that the test is going to need to go against a website. And that's why I would type something into the search field. That's very much focused on a technical detail and implementation detail. It doesn't really matter to describe the behavior there. And then this final one is also really important. Avoid any kind of scripty detail. This is calling out a particular ID that would exist somewhere in the HTML. As anyone who has any experience working on a website knows, these IDs can often change, and you don't want your test to fail because of something like that. You want it to fail because the expected behavior that you were testing for suddenly wasn't in the application, and that wouldn't accomplish that. So, really, if you can look at a Gherkin scenario, recognize any of these things in here, and they happen all the time. then you should start trying to refactor your scenarios so that those technical details aren't in there and that you're really focused on what the expected behavior is.
Right. If I can add, and the reason that happens is oftentimes when you see this anti-pattern, which is super common in the various engagements we've been involved with, it's only typically the testers writing Gherkin and testers using it to run automated tests, right? They're the only consumers and authors of Gherkin. It sort of defeats the point of going this route if you're not going to use it for broader dissemination and conversation, right? So
right, and piggybacking on that, even though we see that most of the time the testers are the consumers of it, they shouldn't be, and I think we want to really emphasize that.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on to unclear test intent, and this one really is super important. Anyone who has had to look at someone else's test that has recently failed, and it's not a test that they authored in the first place, can often be very confused if they open this up and don't understand what it was that the test was supposed to do in the first place. I mean, how are you going to fix it if you don't know? So one thing that's really important is to be as descriptive in that scenario description as you possibly can be. Just saying that you're going to be testing some piece of functionality is insufficient. Now, another thing that I see frequently that can also muddle what that test intent is a misuse of the Gherkin keywords. Now, if you remember from a few minutes ago, Raj went over what given, when, and then all mean. And the given is supposed to set up the test so that all the preconditions are there, and there's supposed to be a when for every single test scenario. And the when is supposed to signal to us that this is the action that is under test. And if you have a then you should be getting some results back from that action. And that's how you're verifying that the behavior was, the behavior that was intended is what was what you got back from that action. What I often see is that there's some confusion over what some of those Gherkin keywords mean. Sometimes I see test scenarios that don't have whens, don't have thens, and I'm confused as to what it was that was intended. So be clear about what the given, when, and then mean. Ensure that you have at least one when, and that you really only have one when per test scenario, and that you have some thens that are verifying that you received what you expected back from that action. Okay. All right. So with those two anti-patterns in mind, let's look at some ways that we can remedy those with this particular one that is improved. I will say up front, this might not be a perfect scenario, but it is better than what we had before. So first thing, we have a much more clear and concise scenario description. This is some sort of happy path test of the basic search. And I'm going to enter some search criteria and find some related results. I don't have a hard-coded URL anymore. I'm just going to go to a website, and hopefully I have some configuration in the test execution that is able to steer me to the right place. I only have the necessary data in my data setup. I'm not concerned about whether the appliance is heavy. I'm looking for a fixture and maybe some sort of room, and I have the data set up to accomplish that. I have proper use of Gherkin keywords. I have given, when, and then. The when is signaling that that search is what is the action that's under test, and I understand what the results are that I'm expecting to get back, and that I've put that in there.
Yeah.
So to underscore this before you go, Raj, I want to make sure that everyone is clear that the scenario is focused on behavior and not implementation.
Yeah, that's all I want to reiterate. Right? Scenarios should be declarative, not imperative, right? Don't not get into the implementation of click this button, and you've got to shy away from that. And I know in this conversation we're not talking about, so how do you really specify that I want to be on this page and so forth? That's beyond the scope of this conversation, but rest assured that that does not belong in Gherkin. That's in the glue code that connects these specifications to the system under test, and that's where the tools such as Cucumber and step definitions come in. But we're not going to discuss that, but rest assured that you should not be seeing those kind of implementation details in your Gherkin scenarios.
Right. All right. And no implementation or scripty details.
Yeah.
You also want to make sure that you set up your scenarios so that you're able to leverage some sort of reusability. With that in mind, cast your eyes on the first half of this particular page where there's a scenario before, and I don't have any quoted strings. So given the user searches for bathroom, tub, and shower, when the user filters on blue under color and the user filters on shower under type, especially that when and statements, they're virtually identical to each other. And very likely you would have other scenarios that would be very similar to that given. It becomes really better as you write more and more tests if you can reuse a lot of these statements, and being able to have some quoted strings that work as arguments to the automation of the test really comes in handy. Okay, so in after, you can see that there are now some quoted strings. So given user searches for bathroom, tub, and shower, in quotes. When the user filters on blue under color, quotes. The user filters on shower under type, and those are quotes. The when and the and are identical to each other now that they are quoted, and automating that becomes a lot easier. You only have to write one of those methods in order to handle both of those statements. Okay. All right. Now, this is one that I'm sure anyone who has worked with Gherkin scenarios has seen time and time again. It's incredibly common, incredibly popular to have super long scenarios that often have multiple behaviors that are being tested all at once. And this one is a great illustration of that. And this is now going into some sort of advanced search, filtering on stuff, using multiple categories. And you can see that here's one scenario, here's another one. I have all of these when statements. Every one of these whens is an indication of another thing, another behavior that's being tested, and another behavior. So multiple scenarios just strung throughout this. And what often happens, I have recognized, is that when you have these super long scenarios and you're trying to test all kinds of things at once, that's when I more often than not see a misuse of the keywords. And this is a great example here. This then basically means, and the next thing the user does this thing, which doesn't at all mean what then is supposed to mean in the context of Gherkin. Then is supposed to mean, then I'm going to test the results that came back from the action. It's not supposed to mean then the user does something else. But when you have these multiple scenarios, these long scenarios, that tends to lead to a tendency to misuse the Gherkin keywords even more.
And if I may add, and oftentimes what I also notice is that when you see these long scenarios, and I think for anybody who's worked with teams that use Gherkin, you probably have run into this, is oftentimes it's long because the triggering action, the when and the then, are just straightforward, but they do a lot of statements with the preconditions. Given I am on this landing page and I click this and I am doing
so
this.
Much.
It's a lot of it is preconditions. Does not belong in Gherkin. You just say the precondition is I am on this designated page, begin there. How you get to that page is not a concern at the Gherkin level. That's the implementation detail. So lift it to the right level. Otherwise, this is impossible for people to understand and really interpret. What is it really trying to test, right? So,
absolutely. And it can fail at so many different points, and then you're kind of lost. So making it clear and concise and focused on a single behavior becomes ever more important to avoid confusion, the rest of the team. So here's a remedy, and one that's very handy Raj didn't go over some of these keywords when he was going over some of the Gherkin basics, but just know that if you see really long scenarios that have multiple behaviors that are being tested, you can leverage this scenario outline keyword and the examples. And what happens then is that with that scenario outline, you can say, this is a very general test case that covers a lot of different scenarios. You can then have places in the scenario description, the given when then, for some substitution values. And then the substitution values come from this example table that's down below. It's very handy, and it makes it so much easier to read and understand. When something goes wrong, it's so much easier to fix. Okay. And here's another remedy, something that is also available to us, another keyword that I think people should be ready to leverage, and it's the background, which basically says when there is a common setup for a bunch of scenarios, just use this background, and then you can have multiple scenarios that then match up with whatever that background is. So the background gets executed before each one of these scenarios gets executed in turn. I find this to be a very easy way to read things. If you get a lot of that setup out of the way, then you can really, really focus, hone in on what is under test and what the expected results are with some very simple when-thens. It's much easier to read, okay? All right. And a final anti-pattern that I've seen, it really becomes much more of a problem as teams accumulate more and more scenarios, feature files. Sometimes they start off and there's no organization. Everything goes into one folder. It's just one great big pile. Another one that we see from time to time is that the feature files are organized in folders that are organized by sprints or some other time-based mechanism. Instead, our recommendation is to organize your feature files in a folder structure by business functionality. If you do it this way, then it's much easier to find things that are like each other. It's easier to identify when test cases might be missing or when you have some duplication of test cases. If you've already written a test case that's very similar to one that has come in brand new, it can be easy to refactor to take, maximize and leverage some of the stuff that's already been done. If any of you are familiar with the movie High Fidelity, then you might be familiar with the picture that's on the right, where Rob was reorganizing all of his records autobiographically, which is a time-based mechanism that I wouldn't recommend for your Gherkin feature files either. So
we've seen this a lot in organizations where they create the feature files based on sprints for whatever reason. It does not make sense why, and I think there may be some underlying reasons as to why some teams seem to organize feature files by time, as George mentioned, which is an anti-pattern, right? It should be based on chunks of system behavior and not time, the feature files.
Let's go through some other remedies. One thing that I have recognized, especially given that before getting into Gherkin, I was writing a lot of Java and C# and Python and all these other things and writing unit tests. There typically is a lot of rigor that comes in having some good coding standards and peer reviews, and those are things that we prize and value in what we view as traditional code. But I think we should also take a similar approach when looking at Gherkin. Obviously, it's not the same thing as code, not exactly, but we should be, think of it as being, recognizing that there needs to be a good and high standard for the quality that goes into the Gherkin scenarios. So here's maybe a handy checklist that you can use and take back to your teams. It's not necessarily exhaustive, but I think it would be a good start if you go and have your own code reviews, peer reviews on your Gherkin scenarios and feature files. So the first item on the checklist is that feature files should be limited to scenarios of related functionality. Don't pile everything in there. Don't have one scenario necessarily per feature. I mean, you can, but it's a good idea to maybe group multiple scenarios in there and make sure that they're all related to each other in a single feature file. Limit the number of scenarios per feature. Now, there are some places that will say that there has to be a limit of X number of scenarios per feature, but we're not going to say that there is an absolute limit, but be reasonable. I mean, obviously, if there are like 100 scenarios in a feature file, that's probably too much. So, get something that is readable and maintainable. Likewise, limiting the number of steps per scenario should also be something that is readable and reasonable, okay? I don't know what the absolute limit should be. I've seen many scenarios that are well in excess of 100 lines, and that's way too much. It should be well below that. I've seen some suggest that 12 is too much. Maybe we don't have to be quite so rigid. I mean, maybe 20 is okay, but don't go way too much further than that. Consistency in spelling, grammar, and spacing can also be really important, especially if you're going to be looking toward reusability. That spelling, grammar, and spacing can be very important. If you have stuff that's a little different, then when you run Cucumber, it's going to try to stub out some new methods that you didn't think you might need. And then finally, don't use punctuation at the end of step phrases. Don't put periods, semicolons, commas, or whatever. Just end it without any punctuation. Yep. Okay. All right. And then the final thing, and kind of coming full circle on all of this, is the power of collaboration. Many of the anti-patterns that we went over, I think, can often be solved on teams if there's really strong collaboration all along the way. If you're doing some BDD and you're having the full discovery, formulation, automation process in BDD, having the three amigos involved, getting those three perspectives of business, development, and testing can make your scenarios much, much stronger. You can bridge the communication gap. Your scenarios are much more likely to be focused on expected behavior, not be so concerned about some sort of UI implementation or be really super testy in some ways. You really establish that shared understanding of needs. The feedback becomes a lot better. The overall quality of your tests are much higher. And in the end, what you have here is an asset to your team that results in better maintainability, readability, and overall durability. Your scenarios, your features, your tests, and even your application are a lot more durable because of all this. Okay. All right. One parting thought, by the way, would be this little catchphrase here, and really speaks a lot to why we sometimes refer to writing good Gherkin solutions as an art. I think you should keep in mind that there is no perfect Gherkin. I mean, we've said that there are better ways to write it, and that really is true. I mean, really recognize where your anti-patterns are, understand why they're anti-patterns, and try to work to eliminate them slowly and surely, and you will naturally improve your Gherkin and get them to a better place. Not necessarily perfect, which is fine. It's better.